has a seat next to them that no one's going to be in, please signal to other people. No?
Same thing
This is the Human Consumption and Population Growth Panel. Thank you all for coming. My name's Amy Jesse. I'm a 3L here at Lewis & Clark. We have two wonderful panelists here for you guys. Stephanie Feldstein is the Director of Population and Sustainability Program at the Center for Biological Diversity. She's also been involved with animal rescue and advocacy for over 15 years. She previously worked at Change.org, where she oversaw and won several campaigns to protect wildlife. And she's also, a little fun fact I found out, a young adult novelist. And then we have Carter Dillard, who is the Director of Litigation at ALDF. He is a co-founder of 4 Feet Forward, which helps small animal advocacy organizations. He's Executive Director of Uncrowded.org, an organization that promotes smaller and more loving families. And he has published numerous articles on animal protection and human population ethics, and also teaches. And I will now turn it over to Stephanie. Thanks.
It's always a little scary when someone says they found a fact about you. But so, you guys know who I am and why we're here. I'm going to start off by talking a bit about human population growth and overconsumption and what we're actually talking about when we talk about these numbers. And you need to have a good understanding of that, and then we'll get into more about the actual law and policy on how we address these issues. So for starters, prior to the year 1800, there were fewer than 1 billion people on the planet. That number doubled over the next 130 years. The next doubling after that only took 45 years. And 36 years later, there were 7 billion people on the planet. Today we have about 7.2 billion, and it shows no sign of stopping. The latest projections say we're about 80% likely to be between 10 and 12 billion by the end of the century. So those are pretty staggering numbers, and we've grown really quickly. And as those numbers have skyrocketed, so have the number of wildlife extinctions. Wildlife, well, our numbers since about 1960s, our numbers have doubled. Studies have shown that populations of both vertebrate and invertebrate wildlife have been cut in half. And species are now going extinct at about 1,000 to 10,000 times the natural background rate, which is the fastest rate since the time of the dinosaurs. We know that didn't work out too well for them. And so, of course, our sheer numbers are staggering. There's never been another large vertebrate animal that's grown as much, as quickly, or with such devastating consequences. But, of course, it's not just our numbers. At the same time, our water use has skyrocketed. Our fertilizer use, the number of cars, the number of phones, the amount of paper we use, even the number of McDonald's worldwide. And you name it, the number of things that we are consuming has skyrocketed along with our population. So it's no wonder that people wonder how we're going to feed the world with this skyrocketing population. And to me, with population growth, it's not just wildlife extinction that it impacts. There's not really any societal problem that's made better by having more people on the planet. I mean, hunger in particular is a big issue that you often hear talked about. Hunger, poverty, all those related issues, they're all exacerbated by our runaway population growth. And to me, this cartoon is a little bit ironic with the train, because people often think that technology is going to save us all. that will have no problem feeding a world of 10 billion people. But when you look at what technology has gotten us, particularly when it comes to agriculture, you get things like pesticides, particularly like neonics that are killing off bees. Guess what? We can't grow food. A lot of our crops, we can't grow them without bees. And you also, of course, get factory farms, which factory farms they've artificially extended the carrying capacity of humans on the planet. Because if we had no factory farms, there's no way that we could have all those billions of animals. There's simply no room for them anywhere on the planet to be raised for food. And by cramming them into these inhumane conditions, that is considered agricultural technology and advancement, and yet it's gotten us to where we are today. And of course, on top of that, our consumption of meat. Our meat addiction is at the top of the list of things that are impacting the environment. There's no other single industry on the planet that's responsible for as much environmental degradation as the meat industry is. It takes incredible amounts of feed, land, water, fertilizers, fossil fuels to make meat. And of course, the output of it is there's an incredible amount of emissions and pollution. Of course, that's not to mention the cruelty toward the farmed animals themselves, and also many, many direct threats to wildlife species. And to give a sense of how bad our addiction to meat is, since the year 1800, like I mentioned, human population has grown 7-fold. Our meat production has grown 25-fold in that time. So clearly, as a society, and particularly here in the United States, we're eating far more animal protein than is even remotely necessary. So to give a sense of what that looks like for wildlife, if you piled all of the wild land vertebrates on the planet, everyone from elephants to mice, everything in between, it would come to about 10 million metric tons in biomass. Humans, pile all of us on a scale, it's about 125 million metric tons. Add in the cows raised for food, that's another 170 million metric tons. Add in all of the livestock raised for human consumption, and that's what the comparison looks like. That sliver at the top, it's mostly chickens. There's about 20 million metric tons of chickens being raised for food on the planet. And again, that's compared to only 10 million metric tons of all of the other wildlife species. So currently, meat consumption, everything else that's the demands of a population of 7 billion people and growing, because people need food, whether it's meat or not, probably not, but people need to eat, they need water, they need land, they need energy. We're currently burning through 1.5 Earths every year. So it's half an Earth more than what the planet can replenish in a year's time. Clearly, that math is going to catch up with us. If everybody in the world lived like Americans, it would take close to 4.5 Earths. Clearly, we only have one planet. It's kind of a problem. I love this map. Even though it's from 2003, there's not a whole lot that would change on it. China would be a little bit darker because obviously they've been going through a lot of industrialization in the past decade. But the biggest thing to note is the United States. You're looking pretty bloated up there. The United States has an outsized footprint. A lot of people, and that's one of the reasons why we focus a lot of our attention when we're talking about population and overconsumption on the United States. But it's also not just our consumption issues. A lot of people don't realize that the U.S. is the third most populous country in the world. And we have a higher fertility rate than any other developed nation on the planet. So there are a lot of good reasons. And of course, being a U.S.-based organization, there's a lot that we can do to influence policy as well as personal habits here in the U.S. So just to give an idea of what all of those things mean more specifically, because they can be big issues, I know they can feel a little bit vague. So I want to talk about the ways that population growth and overconsumption affect some wild species. That's the passenger pigeon. There used to be about 4 million passenger pigeons. It was said that when a flock of them flew overhead, it could darken the skies for days. That particular passenger pigeon is Martha, who died 100 years ago in the Cincinnati Zoo, who was believed to be the last of her kind. There were a number of things that drove passenger pigeons to extinction, one of them being hunting, and they were considered to be a cheap source of meat, which was a big contribution to their demise. Those are Florida panthers. Florida panthers used to range throughout the entire southeast United States. They're amazing big cats here in the US. They now survive on just 5% of their former range in Florida. And their habitat has become so fragmented by development that roadkill is a major threat for the species. And that one is a hellbender. Hellbenders they're great animals. They're North America's largest amphibian. They can grow to be about 2 feet long. And like many other salamanders, they require clean, well-oxygenated water in order to survive. And one of the big pressures on that species is human development, and particularly runoff from factory farms. Factory farms have polluted about 35,000 miles of rivers in the US. And of course, when you have a species like that that requires clean water to survive and they're not getting it, that's not a good sign for the human communities in the area either. It's a loggerhead sea turtle. About 95% of those loggerhead sea turtles breed around Florida. And not to pick on Florida, except that Florida has a number of problems, including that the human population has doubled in about the past 30 years. Florida also has incredible biodiversity. And between the human population growth and the development and beach use on one side and sea level rise from climate change on the other, there are a lot of species like loggerhead sea turtles that are really feeling the squeeze. And then those are Mexican gray wolves. Mexican gray wolves were effectively driven extinct in their habitat in the Southwest. They were down to about 5 animals left. Those animals were taken into a captive breeding program. It was fairly successful. I should say they were driven extinct primarily by ranching interest. They were hunted by ranchers. And the breeding program was pretty successful. Their numbers are starting to rebound, but already they're being targeted again by ranchers. I mean, they're barely back on the map. And one of the reasons why I wanted to highlight some of these animals was not just to personalize it, but you know, a lot of times in the animal rights movement, don't always talk about the rights of wildlife and their right to live, to survive, and also to be free, to live free from suffering and persecution. And that's really one of the areas where the animal movement and the environmental movement can come together. So, with population growth in particular and overconsumption being at the root of pretty much every environmental problem on the planet, among others, nobody's talking about it. You very rarely hear anything about population. And, you know, it's interesting, particularly when you look at this, like climate change, big hot button issue, just about everybody's talking about climate change. But if you have one additional child, there was a study from Oregon State University a few years ago that said each additional child that you have increases your carbon legacy by 20 times what you could save through a lifetime of recycling, driving a hybrid, using low energy appliances, and taking other energy saving measures. So clearly, population is at the root of these problems. But it can feel really awkward for people to talk about population. You're basically going into people's bedrooms and talking about, you know, what their family choices are and how many children they're going to have and whether they're using contraception. And that's one of the big reasons why a lot of people shy away from that. We'll talk a little bit more in a minute on how we approach that. Interestingly, you know, we've been working at the Center for Biological Diversity on population for about 5 years now. Just last year, we expanded the program to talk about overconsumption issues as well. When you do talk to people in the population movement, there's often this divide where some people say it's only population, some people say it's only consumption, but really you have to address both. If you address just one and the other keeps rising, the numbers don't add up. So when we launched the program, our Take Extinction Off Your Plate program, talking about the need to reduce meat consumption, got a lot of pushback. People don't want to talk about their meat consumption, almost as much as they don't want to talk about their family planning choices. And there are a lot of reasons for that. You know, and a lot of it has to do with, it feels like a very personal decision. It's rooted in a lot of, you know, family and cultural heritage and legacy, but it's such a critical issue that we have to talk about. But also, you know, a lot of people talk, similar to climate change, I would say one of the next favorite topics of people, particularly in the environmental movement, is talking about sustainable agriculture. And oftentimes, that conversation happens without talking about what that means for meat consumption. And their number relates to all sorts of issues, including, when you look at GMO-related issues, and you're looking at, I know here in Oregon there's a labeling initiative that's going to be on the ballot. It's a conversation that's happening all over the country around GMOs. A big part of when we're talking about GMOs, we're talking about corn and soy. Guess who eats the majority of corn and soy in the country? Livestock. And usually when you do see labeling requirements, you're not seeing meat packages that say it was fed GMO crops. But that has to be a huge part of the conversation as well. Another one of the big features of sustainable agriculture that people talk about is, people don't want to say we have to reduce meat consumption. They say, well, just pick better meat. Go to and, eat from, non-ruminants who have lower carbon footprints, or eat grass-fed beef. But right now in the U.S., 99% of animals raised for food are raised in factory farms. If we moved all of them out to these so-called sustainable methods, where would they go? How would that possibly be okay for our riparian areas, for the livestock, like right now for the wildlife who are targeted for livestock? The USDA's agency, Wildlife Services, killed about 2 million native animals last year. Many of those were at the behest of livestock, and not just the ones that you hear about all the time, like a lot of people know about wolf-rancher conflicts, but also, prairie dog burrows were basically bombed because they're considered to be hazards for grazing livestock. So there's not really a sustainable way that we can continue at our current level of meat consumption. But what do we do about this? These are a lot of big issues, and a lot of issues that can be hard to talk about. The good news is that most of the solutions are win-win for everybody. When we're talking about population, the solution to population issues is expanding human rights, is making sure everybody has the tools and the information they need to choose for themselves if, when, and how many children that they want to have. And also when we're talking about meat consumption, we're telling people, a lot of opponents on the other side will be like, well, you're telling us not to eat. Well, nobody's telling you not to eat. I mean, we can make better choices. At the Center for Biological Diversity, a lot of times because these are difficult conversations to have, we like to approach them in creative ways, often using humor. This is a Valentine's Day campaign that we did. We also have our endangered species condoms, which there are some up here. Welcome you guys to take. They're actually packages. I haven't seen them before. They actually do have condoms in them, and they have fun sayings on them, like this one is, safe intercourse, safe the dwarf seahorse. And inside there's a bunch of information on population and wildlife. And these have been really effective. We've given away more than 500,000 of these condoms. And of course, not only are we giving out free contraception, which is an important part of the puzzle, but we're also starting a lot of conversations and getting people to think about population and what it means for wildlife. These issues can also be approached by advocating for cultural shifts, which includes corporate campaigns. And for instance, asking McDonald's to add meatless options to their menu. Most people who care about animals and the environment aren't eating at McDonald's, but 70 million people a day are. And that means that if they had a real meatless item on the menu right now, if you ask them about it, they're like, well, you can order anything on our menu without meat. So you can get a Big Mac that's like a bun and a piece of wilted lettuce. But if they actually added it, then that would be 70 million people a day who are being exposed to the idea that you don't need meat with every meal, that there are viable options that you can have that don't involve eating animals. But then, of course, we're here. What about the law? So the Center for Biological Diversity, there are a few things that make us kind of a unique organization. One of them is that we're one of the few environmental organizations that has a full-time program that's dedicated to talking about human population, overconsumption, particularly meat consumption, and the impacts on wildlife. We also, as an organization, use a mix of science, research, and the law to protect endangered species. We use laws like the Endangered Species Act. We've protected more than 500 species and 220 million acres of critical habitat over the past 25 years. But there's not the equivalent of the Endangered Species Act when it comes to dealing with population for a number of reasons, or when it comes to dealing with overconsumption, and particularly meat consumption. Meat consumption actually dodges a lot of laws that should apply to it. But that doesn't mean that there's nothing that we can do about it. And Carter's going to actually talk about this in a lot more detail, but I just kind of wanted to give some highlights of some of the reasons why some of the ways that we can approach is through law and policy. So first, it's the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969. There is a precedent for us to talk about population in conservation laws. Right in the first section, it identifies the profound influences of population growth, even as it's asking the government to consider environmental impacts in its actions. And more recently, this is from a report from the National Marine Fisheries Service supporting endangered species protection for 66 species of corals. And they identified as one of the key threats the number of humans populating the planet and the level of human consumption of natural resources. And the reason I highlight these is because there is a place, even as we're considering conservation law, to start talking more about population. And both in conservation laws and in the creative campaigns that I talked about earlier, the outreach campaigns, just getting people talking about it, you can't really overstate how important that is, because you're not going to get the political will to get any sort of law passed if nobody is talking about it and nobody seems to care about the issue. So we talk about policies that affect population. There are a few things to keep in mind. The first one is must advance human rights and social justice. As I mentioned earlier, the key is really making sure that everybody gets to choose for themselves. So things like, coercive laws, including things like China's infamous one-child policy, those are not going to solve this problem. We also see, internationally, there are a lot of ways to approach this. There are a number of groups that are working, for instance, to end child marriage, to make sure that women and girls have access to education and economic opportunity. Not only does that allow girls to stay in school longer, allow women to contribute to their communities, which is better for everybody, but when girls are educated and have their own opportunities, tend to have children later in life and to have fewer children. I'd also like to note on the human rights one, a lot of people here in the U.S. think that really the way that we should address population is through immigration policy, and that's missing the point. It does nothing for global population, and domestically, immigration policy has had a huge number of human rights violations involved, and also has been bad for wildlife if you look at situations like the border wall. There are a lot of other ways. The access to family planning and reproductive health care is a huge one here in the U.S. In the past few years, we've seen unprecedented attacks on female access to reproductive health care. In situations like the Hobby Lobby case, for example, where some employers can say that they don't feel like covering contraception for their employees. And that makes it harder for women in the U.S. to have access to contraceptives. And also in Texas, there's a case that's in the courts right now. It's actually in federal courts. Earlier this month, U.S. District Court upheld a law that was passed in Texas that put a whole bunch of barriers on abortion clinics operating in the state of Texas. The day that was upheld by a district court, all but 8 clinics closed in the state of Texas. And most of those clinics, to go back to the first point about human rights and social justice, most of them were in the wealthy areas of Texas. So for a woman that lived near the border of Texas, it could take her several hundred miles round trip, more than a month's worth of wages to even get to the clinic to have an abortion. And if she happened to be undocumented, she also risked deportation by coming up against Border Patrol. So it's critical here in the U.S. when we're looking at this in particular that we're understanding that all of these issues that have to do with access to contraception, access to abortion and other reproductive health care is a key part of solving the population problem. And then there are a bunch of other related policies. I think Carter's going to talk a little bit more about this, that promotes choosing a small family versus rewarding larger families. Some of that as well can play into some of the cultural shifts that we were talking about, like basically the opposite of 19 kids and counting. So like that is not a population positive kind of program. And then there are a lot of urban planning policies as well. There are some cities that actually set these goals for themselves, where like our population will double in the next 20 years. And there's not a whole lot else around that. So we need to move away from those policies, and instead of like pushing growth for growth's sake, that looking at policies that provide a better quality of life and more economic opportunity for everybody now, as well as, of course, wildlife conservation. And then on meat consumption policy. Of course, when we're talking about policies around meat consumption, what we're actually talking about is meat production. Talking about meat consumption is a way of getting at production. The meat industry is particularly sensitive to supply and demand. So some of those kind of the highlights of what we look for when we're looking at meat consumption policies. Policies that help advance the cultural shift that I was talking about, making eating meat-free meals more normalized and more available. So that would include things like cities that are passing Meatless Monday resolutions. You're also seeing this in school systems, more school systems that are having vegetarian-only days or days where they explicitly highlight vegetarian options. And that's one of the ways that you can get through policies to reduce meat consumption. And also not only making alternatives more accessible in those ways, but also addressing food deserts. There are some really interesting programs happening in Detroit right now where they're not only supporting local farmers markets, but they're specifically setting up farmers markets in lower income neighborhoods, and they've set it up so that people who are using government benefits can actually get twice the value of their benefits if they're spending the money at a farmer's market as opposed to just going to a grocery store. So things like that can really help getting people eating more fruits and vegetables, thinking less about the need to have meat at every meal. And then, of course, factory farm regulation. Some of this is broad regulation because there really aren't a whole lot of them, dealing with things like, making factory farms responsible for their methane output, for actually dealing with their waste, with all of that, with those manure lagoons that are contaminating groundwater and polluting our rivers throughout the country. But also, one of the interesting crossovers to me is factory farm regulation around things, like gestation crates. There's been a lot of success in the animal movement in advancing laws around particular aspects of factory farming. And while that doesn't necessarily stop the larger problem, it does get people talking. It does make it harder for factory farms to operate, and it does get the public thinking differently about what their choices are and what they want to support and consume. And then, of course, there are, last but not least, subsidies. The meat industry is heavily subsidized. Ranchers are allowed to graze cattle on public lands, which in theory belong to all of us, belong to the wildlife, and they're allowed to graze at very low costs. And actually, grazing on public lands threatens, 175 threatened or endangered species living on public lands are further threatened by the presence of livestock. So that's a pretty damaging subsidy. Those are also some of the things that play into, the true cost, making the manufacturers responsible for the environmental impacts, for example. There are some people who are arguing that meat producers should be responsible for the health impacts as well and the burden on our healthcare system from our meat addiction. And the last thing I'll say is that all of these factors, they also apply to other types of overconsumption as well. You see this very successfully in things like plastic bag bans that we've seen coming up more frequently. And a lot of times when plastic bag bans, for instance, come up, it's done in a way that incentivizes using alternatives. We've gotten to a point now, everything used to be plastic bags before. Now we're at a point where throughout the country there are many places where you see reusable bags being more of the norm. And it also helps to shift some of the cost. Like if you look at the states that have passed laws for that have returnables on I'm from the Midwest, on pop, cans and bottles. A lot of that is putting the burden back on the manufacturers, is the point of that, to get them to have to pay for their waste. So with that, that's just contact information, and I'll pass it over to Carter to talk a bit more about some of the individual laws.
talking about family size and population, I think, is actually harder than just talking about animal rights. I think that the possibility of talking about family size as something which is open for public discussion because everybody has an interest in that subject is probably where the discussion about people talking about diet and meat was 20 years ago. So I'll start with just a little bit of good news, and I think what I've seen is tremendous strides with it when it comes to reducing consumption of meat. Despite the fact that vegans make up this minuscule percentage of the population, the reality is that things like ag-gag laws would not exist if the industry were not sensitive to the impact demonstrated through studies, that revelation about how they operate, the impact that has on consumption. And lawyers that are sitting in this room are making sure that ag-gag laws are getting shot down as unconstitutional, as well as lobbyists in this room that are pushing for the application of basic cruelty standards to factory farms through ballot initiatives and other methods. Lawyers in this room that are working on mandatory labeling on meat, poultry products, things like whether or not they were produced with subtherapeutic antibiotics. So the reduction in consumption, partially driven through revelations about the reality of how factory farms work, where our meat comes from, this is a trend that's moving in the right direction. It's incredibly hopeful. And for something that was so seemingly impossible 20 years ago, where I think soon circuit courts, federal circuit courts will hear whether or not ag-gag laws are constitutional, and all of the public values that are swept up into that question, something that was probably unthought of decades ago. It's now reality. And the other reality, when it comes to equally, I think, even more controversial subject of family size, the reality is that people are having much smaller families than their ancestors were, than even a few generations ago. When in the middle of the 20th century, average family size was about 5 to 6 children per woman. Today it's down to about 2.5. And there's an incredible variety across the world in terms of the family size. But the trend is clear that people are choosing to have smaller families. So as difficult as the conversation is, the reality is that we're really already moving in the right direction. That's not accidental. It happened, and we'll talk about this, it happened because of large-scale interventions in the middle of the 20th century, obvious population policies that you all know about, but less obvious population policies like legalization of contraception, ability for women to terminate their pregnancies, the ability to choose family size. Now, the question is, were those interventions enough? What else can be done? So this brings us to the main problem, which is the Brady Bunch. I chose, if you all know the show, I'm a little dated, but they're actually not a traditional family. The children came to each of the parents in the script from prior marriages, but this was the model, even in the middle of a culture that was well aware of the dangers of overpopulation. This was sort of a cultural model that was being promoted, and it's a cue to people about family size and what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. People think that's ridiculous. Actually, one of the most effective ways of influencing family size is something called Subito method. It's by creating role models in particular cultural contexts that choose smaller families. It's been demonstrated to be one of the most effective ways to influence family size. These role models usually appear in sitcoms or soap operas, but it's hugely influential on people's decision regarding their family size. So actually these things are important. This is really the problem, is how the child actors turn out when they grow up. No, I'm kidding. The Brady Bunch, as bad as I'm picking on them, they were right, because in fact they react with abject horror to the future large model family, the Dugars. This is again indicative, family size it's indicative of, I think, the move in the right direction. The Duggar family is interesting to us. They're famous. They are an icon because they're considered unusual, and in many cases unusual in a not-so-good way. Again, it's a sign in the positive direction, but it's important to note family size is important because, to give you an example, 1995, average child per woman was about 3.195. If that had continued at that rate until 2150, given the nature of geometric growth, UN population projection, 256 billion people on the planet. It's the nature of exponential growth. It's something you hear a lot about today in the news with epidemiologists talking about the nature of Ebola transmission. People don't understand. It's something humans don't understand, the nature of exponential growth, but it's a factor with population. So, how do we even start the discussion? We're at an animal law conference, so I think the relevant place is to start with the relevance of population growth to animals. And I think the relevance is pretty clear, right? We want to promote animal well-being, animal rights. Can't do that if there aren't any animals. And we can't do that by just assuming that animals are things that live in our world. Because as Stephanie said, part of animal rights is giving them their own world. It's giving them autonomy, which means their own habitat. And it means a lot more than just having a few specimens, like the last passenger pigeon, remaining in our zoos. But this is the relevance of human population growth to animals. And we know that there is an 88% correlation between population density and extinction. But we don't need studies. It's not an empirical thing. It's common sense. Right? You have a limited space, growing number of one species that is certainly dominant and in most cases absolutely violent towards other species. You can guess the consequences. So growth matters. What do we do about it? We can all sit around here at this conference and talk about the importance of family size. When we say that, there's a normative thing built into it. We're talking about smaller families, what one should and shouldn't do. But that's going to be a problem. Everyone knows this. And that's the coordination problem. So the people that are really concerned about it, really thinking about how to responsibly live their lives, are now taking action. That's not very helpful if other people are not doing the same. We have a coordination problem. It's like driving on the road, right? It doesn't help you to be going 55 if the person behind you is going 80 when they hit you. And in fact, if the roads have plenty of people that are going 80, a lot of people that are probably good drivers choose to stay off the road. Maybe some people choose to forego having children entirely. And that's not really fair if the reason they're doing that is because other people's families are so large that the future those people would bring their children into is so bleak that they don't want to do it. That's not fair. So there has to be some sort of coordination. In the end, coordination comes down to law, right? That's how we coordinate our behaviors. We get together in a democratic society, we elect leaders, we vote for laws, we come up with some sort of a system. Doesn't mean it has to be coercive, but it does mean it has to be cooperative. We have to come together and sort of think about ways, all of us, to address the issue, because it won't help if just the Lewis and Clark Animal Law Conference attendees start thinking about this issue. It has to be done in a more coordinated fashion. And that's the way we do a lot of things. So is it a bleak future into which none of us should bring children? It could be. I don't think any ecologist could tell us how we could live on a planet in a good way. 26 billion people on the planet. And this is all pegged to fertility. It's all choices. Generally, high fertility, 2.5 and up towards 3 children on average in the world will bring us up to the UN high fertility, high population variant for 2100. That drops down to between 1 and 2, about 1.5. It starts to drop off. Why the drastic disparity? because there are so many of us, right? So small changes in fertility with lots of people equals large results. What do we do if we're all going to get together as a nation and talk about how do we deal with the issue? Where do people think the trouble started? We're going to solve an issue, solve a problem. Maybe the first question is, when did the problem start? Where did the problem start? Anyone have any thoughts?
Adam and Eve.
Adam and Eve. That's not actually on the chart. A little further back. Anyone else?
After World War II,
Why? Why after World War II?
Antibiotics.
because there was a population decline.
Right. Well, so one argument here, somewhere back in here, mass die-off in a particularly unpleasant way, baby boom reaction to that. Any thoughts?
Industrial revolution.
Why that?
Because you didn't have to decline.
Incredible, not only those advances around the time of the Industrial Revolution, but also the beginning of modern medicine. Mortality drops off significantly. People are living longer, children are living longer. Chris?
I was going to say, same thing, antibiotics, prolonging life.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would say modern medicine when suddenly fertility continues, mortality is no longer the problem that it was. Joyce?
Modern sanitation and plumbing.
Mm-hmm. Modern sanitation and plumbing, same thing. So we're not dying of the same diseases that we used to. Again, a mortality issue. This is theoretical. I'm going to propose one possible solution here, and that is that I think maybe one area the problem might have started. Stephanie had said it's actually not on the chart. It's around the 19th century, around 1800, when the world was about 1 billion people or so. And I suggest why that is. I said we have this problem of growth. Have to come together to solve it. Who's we? Who am I referring to when I say we?
Everybody.
What was that?
Everybody.
Everybody. Who's everybody?
The whole world.
The whole world, so that's the UN. That's the only, not the most effective organization in the world. We have to work through the UN if it's everybody. Who else is we? I think there is something underlying the assertion that we have to do something. We have to do something all together to solve this. That there's a value we're all speaking about. When we say we, I think we mean coordinating a society. It means through government and law. Today, almost universally, the only acceptable form of government is a democratic government. Government elected by its people, and that reflects values that are drawn essentially from political liberalism. That's the beginning of the idea of democracy and everybody coming together. That background, when we say we have to all get together and do something, that presumes a certain form of politics where people come together, they form a social contract, the terms of that contract are the laws, and they all agree voluntarily to follow those laws. That system, which presumably we all agree with if we agree with democracy and think that we ought to have a say over our government, that already speaks to values that can help us address population growth. Because it presumes something about the world around us. When Locke was first talking about political liberalism and the idea of sovereignty of the people, he was presuming that they came from what he called the state of nature. Places where there was no justified human influence because people were just sort of at war with one another, and they needed government to come together and justify that influence. That state of nature traditionally has been interpreted as just the absence of government. But there's a real interpretation, there's a legitimate interpretation of political liberalism that says, no, that state of nature was a real thing called wilderness, where there was no permanent, lasting influence of humans, where we valued the non-human world because it was primarily a place for non-humans, where the non-human world around us, from which we could come and then associate with other people, associate with them and let them influence us, consent to their influence, constructed in a way through government whereby it became justified by our consent, that all happened against a background called the non-human world or wilderness, and that the only thing that justified government was our ability to consent to other people's influence, which is impossible if we've got a world that's nothing but human influence. If there's no biodiversity, there's no wilderness, there's nothing left but human influence, there's nowhere from which we could have come to consent. There's nowhere for us to withdraw and leave and cancel out our consent. So one idea behind this value that we all share, and even the most conservative anti-animal folks out there will embrace this idea of democracy and political liberalism. The whole thing occurs against the background of the absence of human power, political liberalism, liberation from human power. And that core value in our democracy, that's something we can use to promote animals' interests, the environment's protection, and human rights. Because wilderness, biodiversity, places absent human power, those are invaluable and necessary for the very ideas of democracy and political liberalism. If that's where the trouble started, how do we get back to a world, given our rates of consumption, that can promise us wilderness around us, that our societies can be organized in a way that we're surrounded by nature? I think it's embracing, in all of our areas of law that we'll talk about at the conference here, I think it's embracing this idea of the non-human world. If you're a human rights lawyer interested in human rights, you'll understand that you cannot have a consensual political association without areas absent human power. If you're an animal rights attorney, you'll consider that every single human political organization, that all of our societies are organized against a background of non-human autonomy, where our relationship to the non-human world is that they have their own world. And how do we relate to animals in the most ideal way? They consent to our interaction. This is that's sort of idyllic, admittedly, but things like Locke's concept of government was certainly an ideal in the face of monarchies. And today it's our paradigm. These things can happen. But ideally, for animal rights lawyers, we're talking about giving animals back their habitat, non-human world. And for environmental lawyers, the idea of the non-human world is just as important. One of the big problems in environmental law is there's a baseline problem. What sort of a world does environmental law move us towards? Sometimes the law gets lost trying to answer that question. Is it just a healthy, safe, pleasant environment for humans to live in? Certainly that's behind a lot of our laws, and it's probably led to where we are today, where environmental law failed to stave off climate change. Maybe an alternative baseline for environmental law is political associations surrounded by a world that's really generally absent human power. So you're surrounded by the conditions to which you could return if you wanted to cancel out your voluntary human political association. And that world, the non-human world, would be the baseline for environmental law. So when we say we have to regulate humans' impact on the world, what you're really talking about is regulating our impact on biodiversity, on animals' habitat. Because in the end, I think it's very possible that we can advance human interests, animal interests, and the interests of the environment by liberating humans from one another and our influence. And I think the way that we are probably likely to do that is by continuing our current trend of having smaller families. Why? Why this? Why not just consumption? Why deal with population? Well, I was at a conference recently talking about this issue. A person made a great point. He said, well, you're talking about trying to limit people's consumption. You're trying to essentially promote something that was a little unpopular called the Great Depression, where people could not afford to do anything, and if people are voluntarily choosing to have smaller families, they're not voluntarily appearing to cut their consumption, you certainly should be focusing on population. Whatever your reasons are I think the point is clear, you have to do both. Because it's simply a multiple one of the other, and you can't get away from the fact that if you're not addressing numbers, you're just addressing consumption, you're not solving the situation. Certainly, access to reproductive health services is part of the solution. We all know that massive number of pregnancies carried in this country are unintended, and that people having children in situations where they wouldn't want to have them is a violation of human rights. But it's hard not to also talk about family size choice in that situation. Why? People could simply, if it's simply a matter of choice, it's nothing, there's really nothing to prevent choices that could culturally lead to larger families, right? It's simply sort of left open. And that could be a problem if we're really valuing something like the non-human world that relies on us not exploding to 16 billion. If the number's dropping voluntarily and we can't just leave it at choice, what can we do to talk about family size? I'll wrap up pretty quickly by saying I think there are 5 intuitions when we talk about family size that bring us out of this idea of simply leaving it at choice. And the background for leaving it simply a matter of personal choice came, that background to our thinking today about how to think about family size, that came from something very particular. The quick background story is that middle of the 20th century, when governments were thinking about interventions to change family size because they were concerned about population growth, they're very clever and realized that to overcome cultural taboos, and in fact a lot of laws, a lot of religious laws that prohibited things like contraception use, abortions and other things that people could use to control family size, they were clever, and Stephanie already referred to it. They hooked into an intuition that people have about the bedroom. And they realized that whether to have a child or not have a child, this decision may or may not get made in the bedroom. And they translated that area into something called privacy, personal privacy. We all know the constitutional law cases that developed the idea of personal privacy. And that created a space for people to choose to have smaller families by using things like contraceptives and other forms of reproductive health services that were previously taboo. Those things became legal and they became protected by constitutional standards that allow us private choice. The problem is that by creating that model of privacy, they fused together the decision to have a child and to not have a child. Because that decision gets made in the bedroom. Maybe it gets made in the kitchen. I don't know where you guys are into it, but the bedroom seems to be the go-to. So the theoretical problem with that, the decision not to have a child may reflect some autonomous decision to remain by yourself. The decision to have a child is not properly characterized as a private decision because of its impact on other people. Its impact on the child, its impact on others in society, its impact on the world. But you fuse those two together, you create a zone of privacy, now people can control decisions. The numbers drop off dramatically in the 20th century. That's great. Was it enough? Maybe we revisit whether we need to fuse those two decisions. Maybe the decision not to have a child is a private, personal matter. Maybe the decision to have a child, given its impact on the child and the rest of the world, is not necessarily a private matter. So what do we do about it? What are the intuitions that might help get us out of this conundrum where now we have protection for the decision not to have a child? We don't seem to have any protection that allows us to have a child. Humans seem to value the idea of continuing their own lives as best they can through having children. A lot of studies have shown when you ask people why they have kids, what they really value is that they view it as a unique way to replace something that they are losing every day of their lives. Their own lives, right? Because they are mortal. And they view having children as the best way to continue the thing they value. That's their life. Why? Because the child can also self-replicate. It's a shot at some version of immortality. The child is a reflection of the parents. It's a unique, in their view, a unique way of continuing on their lives. That's helpful because it protects the right to have children. It's also helpful because that continuity is generally achieved at about 1 or 2 children. Depending on how you view continuity and that value, it's got a built-in mechanism that may limit it. Regardless of whether you believe in continuity as a value or not, the reality is that every bioethicist will tell you the value of having children seems to diminish objectively with every child you have. Why? What we asked if no one had if no one had ever had a child, would you protect their right to have a child? Generally, most people would say yes. If someone had had 25 children, what's the value to that person of having a 26th child? Probably not as high. There's an intuitive diminishment in the value. So whether you're in a continuity or you just embrace the diminishing nature of the value of having children, there's something built in. There's something else that's quite valuable here. We all value the well-being of children. If we move that well-being back to the conditions in which they're born, there are objective reasons to hold off having a child until you can guarantee some bare minimum of conditions for that child. Right? We're not going to have a child necessarily in a home where we know the parents are likely to abuse or neglect the child because they've done so to the previous 2 or 3 children. What about fairness? There's another value, another intuition we have. One of the problems with equality or fairness today in the world is that this reaction to the idea of moving resources around between people because that's not fair because people work at different levels. And you can't simply redistribute resources to everyone equally every year because some people work hard, some people don't work so hard. This has become a problem for equality. Now, that problem does not exist for children because children really are not responsible for the conditions in which they're born and the opportunities that they get out of life. So the ability to distribute among children in a more equal way also provides some reason for thinking that there are conditions which we should be raising before we bring children into to give them a fair shot at life, some equality of opportunity. That's an intuitive value we can use to, again, think about not just family size, but conditions and minimum conditions in which children should and shouldn't be born. Fourth value is nature. We've already talked about this. If you value political liberalism, liberation from human power, you value the non-human world. And that underlies the very idea of the social contract and democracy. And once we leave the non-human world and we come and consent to each other's influence and form some government, we're going to do it in a way that we're assuming certain values with the people that we do it with. We come together, we create a social contract, we do it voluntarily, which means people voluntarily agree to those terms and adhere to them. That creates, again, a minimum standard for our fellow citizens. We're all going to demand these things of our fellow citizens. Again, creates requirements for what we do and what we give to children who are going to become our fellow citizens. It gives us an interest in how children are being raised because those children are going to share equal power with you in a democracy. They're going to have power over you. So these 5 values dispel the idea of privacy, but not in a way that's going to really harm the idea of a right, protected right to have children. But we are going to begin to think about, perhaps, having children in a way that's different than the idea of not having children. So the end, essentially, is that I think we're moving in the right direction. I think we can accelerate that move by trying to break apart the sort of middle of the 20th century notion that having a child and not having a child is the same thing because they're both a private, personal decision that the parents make irrespective of the influence of that decision on others. But we can do that in a way that doesn't interfere with the recognized human right to have children. We just do it so that we promote 5 values that the decision to have a child necessarily implicates. And there are 5 values that I think that we all have agreed are inherent in our society. Thanks very much.
So we have about 30 minutes for questions, which is nice. I'm sure there's a lot. Go ahead.
Okay, why does it not having a child have as much impact on society as having a child? For all the same reasons having a child. There's someone who's not going to be eating, not doing this, not doing that. Wouldn't that have just as much impact?
Well, yeah, so I guess you could argue that you wouldn't have the same level of growth, but you could probably also argue that the child would go on to become a scientist. It could be that cures some disease, right?
Or not have a scientist and not commit a crime.
Yeah, but I think it's all speculative as to what would have happened, right? But if you have a child, some of that is not speculative. We know the impact every human has on the planet. That's not speculative. That's an impact that can be accounted for.
But it's also the impact of not having humans. Is just as speculative. Impact of not having humans. And it's just speculative that human will, we don't know, could die in early childhood. It's speculation too. I think the speculation cuts both ways.
No, it's good. Yeah, I think you can establish that a human that is born, given the certain conditions they're born in, will have an impact on the world in terms of consumption, pollution, and other things that can't be denied. Those things are not speculative and pretty much expected. Those impacts don't exist when someone doesn't have a child, and whether that child that they didn't have would have become Mozart is speculative.
I think it's more certain that the child you don't have is not going to consume. That's absolute certain. The child you do have is a little bit more doubt because they could die early or not do it. But if you don't have the child, you know absolutely they're not going to.
No, agree. Yeah, all I would say is I think that's true. The child that you don't have, not having that child is going to have certain impacts. But if you take these 5 values like nature, continuity, well-being, those sorts of things, you can serve those values when you think about having a child as being an impactful thing. If you're pursuing other values, like maximizing economic growth, which is inconsistent with nature, then I think that's the sort of impact you're talking about, not having a child as being impactful. But I'm presuming a background of values that are inconsistent with things like economic growth, maximizing economic growth. And if you take those values, then I think there's a big distinction between having a child and not having a child. But if you take other values, maybe it falls apart.
One thing that I would add that's a little bit different from your question, but looking around the audience, the majority of women in this room are in their 20s and 30s. I would say that culturally, it's really important that the way that we treat women and their family planning decisions, there needs to be no distinction between whether you're choosing to have that small family or you're choosing to have no children. Is anybody else in here who has felt some of that pressure to have children? And that there's a sense that if you don't have kids, your life has no worth. And culturally, that's a really big thing that from the female perspective we need to address in order to have that larger cultural change to get at the issues of making smaller families the norm.
Can I just comment on that? I was sorry.
If it's quick, yeah.
I'm really glad you brought that up because I'm in my 40s and I don't have children, and people find it very odd that I'm in my 40s and I'm in my 40s and I've never been married and have children. And people seem to find it much more normal if I said, "Oh, he's divorced with 2 children." That's way more normal to have made that mistake and get divorced with 2 children than not to have children at all. And I think a lot of our, what I see in the media, TV commercials, dishwashing liquid and mattresses, everything always has these people with wedding rings and children, and we're so conditioned that this is normal. Even if you get divorced, that's more normal than choosing not to have children at all. So I'm really glad you brought that up.
Go ahead.
I was slightly uncomfortable with this whole discussion, and I will form this into a question, but so I'm a vegan animal rights lawyer, and I work with a lot of animal rights activists who are choosing to not have children for this very reason. Now, if we're not reproducing, who's going to work on this next generation? So I'm at a point where I'm contemplating creating a family, and the main reason is because I want to leave a legacy. That is the best way to ensure that a vegan activist will be here next generation is to raise one. So I don't know, I feel like it's a dangerous message to transform out.
I think that.
You know,
I mean,
Okay, let's hand it to the panelists for answers to discuss this.
Carter mentioned it a little bit in his talk, and I'm sure I'll say more about it too, about that. And obviously, everybody in this room and in our movement has the right, if they want to have children, just as much as anybody else. I mean it when I say it's a right for everybody in the world to make the decision.
But for the animals.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that I get that question a lot. And everyone in this room, think about people you know and how many of them share the same exact value of their parents. All of us have
I think I would suggest what you're saying points to this absence of the ability to coordinate. That there is a coordination problem when we're in a birth race against our fellow citizens. And we will not win that race against Michelle Dunbar. So the solution, in my opinion, is to come together and try to find some shared values so that you don't feel the need to replicate your political values through your children, which is speculative, but so that instead we're all replicating our values, continuing our values that we can all share through discourse, I would hope. But
I just don't want to see people like that family reproducing and us not.
Wait to see where all those Duggar kids are in 20 years. I guarantee some of them will be on our side.
I just want to kind of bounce off the way. I'm another person that decided not to have children, and my best friend has 3, and I put everything that I have into those kids. I put everything that I would want for my kids into them. So I feel like that's my way of passing it on. I'm not going to have my own children, but I go through her children, and that's my way of sending it on to the next generation, I think.
As far as coordination goes, what it looks to me like a fertility clinic is kind of easy to regulate, like through spam goods. And, you know, it's like that's something where it's like reproduction in a situation where it wouldn't naturally be possible always. Like, do you feel like that's an issue? Like, how much impact that have?
One argument is that people that are infertile, it is unfair if society is able, through technology, to solve that problem, to keep them from equal access. One way to, if you're coordinating around something like continuity, one way to do it would be simultaneously cut off the $1,000 child credit every year that we get at 2 or 3 children, just symbolically. I'm not sure how much that 1,000 matters to a lot of people, but it does. But it's just a symbolic move, while you also perhaps limit some of the subsidies going to fertility programs after a certain number of children, which is just at least a symbolic way of signaling something like diminishment.
Fertility clinics raise a lot of questions because it often leads to more and more children than originally intended. They're a relatively small part of the problem. The bigger problem is, like, worldwide, there are more than 200 million women who want access to modern contraception and can't get it. I would say a better place to focus energy not only on that, but when we look domestically, on promoting adoption.
Another counter to that is that in the United States, after World War II, you also saw pet ownership skyrocket as people became more economically mobile. They became more geographically mobile. So they would take a job in New York and they'd be lonely, so they would replace that with companion animals. Same thing, the families back home being empty nested would do the same. Interestingly, in China, so I studied this sort of the history of veterinary science and looking at different cultures throughout sort of antiquity through the pinhole of veterinary science as an indicator of the way of different culture valued animals and how well they treated them and if they cared about that. China was always very absent in that. Almost no veterinary history, very little care. One thing, Joyce and I participated in this U.S.-China roundtable recently, and one thing we're finding now is this whole single-child generation in China have no siblings. So they have all these surrogate siblings. So you've seen pet ownership, cats and dogs, skyrocket in China, and as a result, you've got this whole generation now that is much more animal-centric, if you will, that cares a lot more about animal issues, and you see this huge growth in China of people caring a lot about animals. So it's regardless of passing it on or whatever, there's been a huge benefit for the animals by actually having reduced children.
Are they adopting or are they buying animals?
I mean, that's a different question.
One thing I think I heard from your very different talks was that this is really a cultural issue. Change has to come from cultural change. I was going to ask you, first, did I get that right? Did what you were both saying earlier, this is not something we can just simply legislate, we have to change culturally. The other point I'd like to ask you both to comment on is this is really a worldwide problem, but one area you really didn't have a chance to touch on is the disparities in the world and how you might tackle this problem given those disparities.
Yeah, that could be a whole another half hour talk.
I'm ready for that.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of times when we, that consumption map that I showed where the U.S. was all red and bloated, one of the things when we talk about consumption is that it is important as we're looking at the need to reduce our own environmental and our own carbon footprint here in the U.S., we need to bring it up in other areas of the world. And that's actually directly related to population in a lot of ways because in order for reproductive health and family planning clinics to be able to operate throughout Africa, throughout India, throughout some of the other places with higher fertility rates, they need a certain amount of energy. They need to have access to the same tools that we have in order for that to happen. So there definitely is an equity issue, and that's part of, kind of the broader issue that I brought up around social justice. And I would say that in a lot of ways it is largely a cultural shift, but as I mentioned, there are a lot of different ways where we can get at it legislatively. Through things like access to reproductive health care, through policies that could promote adoption, that could pull back some of the extra credits for additional children. So there are ways to influence cultural changes through legislation. And I do want to comment real quick on the one thing about the one-child policy in China, which is sort of related to the global picture as well, is the next generation in China now, there are a lot of people culturally who it has caused a shift where a lot of people in China are now saying that they don't want big families anymore, that they like being the center of attention, that they saw that there's a better quality of life having fewer children. But we can't ignore all of the human rights violations that happened as part of that law being passed. And so the things that we're looking at now that we're saying, okay, well, there are maybe some better things that came out of that. I would never advocate for having a one-child policy anywhere else ever again because there were so many horrible violations that happened and so many horrible ramifications for both parents and children and the environment.
Can you give an example? Horrible. So one child sounds good to me.
Infanticide. There are a lot of people, male children are considered more valuable. So female babies were killed or abandoned. I mean, that's a pretty big one for me.
Yeah, that works.
And I want to add, I mean, the disparity, the larger families abroad in some places and smaller families in some parts of the developed world, that in some ways gets canceled out by the disparity in consumption and level of pollution, which that disparity is greater than the family size. But if we're talking about universal human rights, then this idea of coordination should apply to some standard that we all come to globally. Secondly, I think there can be a role for the law in influencing family size. And I think this idea made more popular. It's always been around, but Cass Sunstein made it a little more popular recently with his book Nudge. The idea of not pushing people to do things, but using the state as a particularly influential voice because it's the state to signal people the direction they ought to go. Like, we're going to drop your $1,000 a year tax credit after the second child. Just a symbolic signal, but people seem to pick up on it. And the greatest area where I think that's borne out has been seatbelts. So originally started as something where the state would step in with a $50 fine or something. Today, you get in the car, your friend doesn't put on the seatbelt. You say, "Oh, what are you doing?" It's this cultural norm. That's the China study from UC Irvine 2007 said it had been internalized as a cultural norm now. The one-child policy didn't require enforcement. So I think there's a role for the state in what's considered a more modern governance, soft law kind of way.
This is a question more for Carter. You mentioned intuitive value a few times. I'm just not clear to me what that means, for one. And then what role do you think intuitive value plays within the law within the political liberal system? Because sometimes we say, well, we shouldn't have laws to force values of any kind. I
think values I think they're at the heart of everything we do. I think you could not empirically prove that an animal suffering is a bad thing. You could show the neurons firing and the biochemical processes in the animal's mind, but in the end, to think it's bad, you have to jump into values. And I think that underlying all of the reproductive rights jurisprudence in the United States was this intuitive idea of personal privacy. I think that's a value that we've created, and it plays a role because it's now the value at the heart of a constitutional prohibition on things like laws that limit contraceptive use or that interfere at some level with a woman's right to terminate her pregnancy. So that's when I say values. I think we've articulated something in our law called privacy. I think we can also articulate another value called continuity. And it would do something else that also protects the right to have children, but do it in a different way.
I'm following you on the value part. What do you mean by intuitive? It's not supported by anything else? Or?
Well, I think in the end, when we say it's wrong to hurt animals, I think in the end that just comes down to an agreement between all of us that we feel that way, that intuition. Because you can't empirically prove that it's wrong. You cannot show in a graph, this is wrong to hurt animals. You can show their level of pain goes up. But to say normatively, you shouldn't do that, that's when we have to flip into. It's just inside of us. I don't think there's a way outside of us to demonstrate that.
Okay.
Oh, thank you. I really liked both of your talks, and I loved the mention about adoption, because I was thinking about that too in that context. But piggybacking off of your answer to that question about intuitive values, and sort of contrasting that with being able to have empirical studies that would show us something about values. I mean, that seems to me to be right, but I mean, you did actually reference some philosophers. So, I mean, there are ways to philosophically argue using reason for the efficacy of some values over other values. So I don't think you have to just say it's intuitive, because that will mean you'll compete with people who have other intuitive values and you have nothing to back it up. So I think you could probably be stronger on that. But I wanted to ask you about, you were focusing a lot on the values of political liberalism. What about so many parts of the world where political liberalism and democracy are not how their states are run? They're run by religious tyrants. So their structure is completely different. So something like appealing to law for all or something like that, they're not going to be listening. And many of those people are having a lot of the children in the world. So what would be the response to trying to, I don't know, convince them that maybe they might want to think differently about this problem?
Well, I'll say one thing. I think the argument against intervening in those situations to achieve lower fertility is that it violates human rights. So right then you bought into the framework that would be used arguably to solve the problem if we talk about things like the importance of nature to actually consenting to human influence. So when I get an argument back about you can't talk about family size because of human rights, my response is, well, then we should embrace human rights, and there's a way to use that system to solve the problem. And arguably, I mean, given the values underlying the United Nations, those pockets of, those tyrannical pockets are things that should be changed, and that shouldn't be the norm. And I think now it's almost universally accepted, maybe should be accepted, that the only justification for one human's power over another is that the person consented to that power.
I mean, as we both mentioned a few times, there are a lot of benefits to addressing population growth. Not just in terms of, other species and the environment, but also in terms of quality of life for your own children, addressing issues like poverty and hunger and all of those things. And those are all things that everybody is worried about. No matter what the government is, they're worried about those issues. A great example, actually, Iran had a voluntary program for a long time where from their government, which is not a democratic government like ours, they came out with very strong messaging saying, they were putting up billboards that were saying, something like, choose enough, one is better, or it's like, they had this huge public messaging campaign, and their fertility rates dropped, significantly. They were among the lowest in the region. Then, fortunately, recently they started reversing that and deciding that they, wanted to have a larger population, but that's an example of one where it doesn't necessarily need to come from thinking about it in terms of our own legal system, just kind of thinking about what all the benefits are, even if you don't necessarily believe in human rights broadly. You probably believe in having a healthy population and reducing poverty and bettering your own economy.
I'm a little troubled by the proposal to cut the earned income credit after the second child. I see a possible racial element in that, and I feel that perhaps incentivizing would work better, just as we've seen that certain countries are giving money to, I believe, Zimbabwe and previously Brazil to keep Zimbabwe and Brazil from destroying more of their rainforest, and that's been working pretty well. And I think it might work better if we said, and starting with the U.S. and maybe going on to other countries in the developed world, say, okay, if you only have one child, you're going to get an extra however many $1,000 credit on your income tax. But that might work better than saying, okay, if you have 3 kids, we're not going to give you this credit. Have you thought about that at all?
Yeah, well, one option would be just to vary it so that you're cutting the income at the highest income levels, so that credit drops off for 2 children at the families that are probably consuming the most, and that the tax savings then may go into investing in raising the level of welfare for the children that need it the most. So you take that money out of the idea that everybody should have as many as they can, and the government signals that by paying you $1,000 a child, to, well, at certain levels of income you should have fewer, and that money should be redirected to raise the floor that people should shoot for and achieve in the families that need it. I think that's one way to, and that would serve the fairness value in that, I should have the right to have a child. I have to have that child in a certain minimum level of conditions. Families that have a lot of money shouldn't have so many children. They should share that money with me so that child, family floor comes up. That might be one way to do it.
I think the issues that you bring up are very important and ones that we have to think about, and particularly relevant when we're looking at access to family planning and reproductive health care. In the U.S., the actual number for unintended pregnancies in the U.S. is 50%. It's higher than the global average. And when you look at where a lot of unintended pregnancies are happening, at places like, for instance, in Detroit. Detroit has an abortion rate that's 3 times higher than the rest of the state of Michigan, close to that for the national average. And a lot of that has to do with because the state cut funding for family planning and reproductive health care. And it's much harder for people in Detroit to be able to access the services that they need, and that's when they saw the abortion rate go up. So it's all very closely tied together into a lot of the social justice and environmental justice issues, and those do need to be a part of the conversation.
So we have time for one more. Feel free to talk to them after. I'll go with you.
Okay, for those of us that are sympathetic to your arguments, this question is for both of you, and are looking for places to volunteer with or places to donate to, what organizations would you recommend aside from your own?
Well, I was going to say you should sign up to be an Endangered Species Condoms volunteer. So you can do that at endangeredspeciescondoms.com, and we send out tens of thousands of condoms every year to people. So yes, that's one of them. Carter mentioned the Sabito method. There's an organization called Population Media Center, and they use that method around the world, working within local communities to create serial dramas. They have one program in the U.S. that's a popular program on Hulu called East Blows High, but they also most of their programs are international, and they use whatever the medium is that's best for that country. In many cases, it's radio that they can reach the most people. So they're an organization that's doing a lot of work on this and also thinking about environmental side of things.
Yeah, and I'll throw a vote out for a group in the UK called Population Matters, which the UK, being an island, has suddenly, population growth has become suddenly more relevant. And they're quite strident and philosophically advanced, and they've got their tentacles deep in the UN and EU law. So I think Population Matters is an interesting group.
And there's also a group based in the UK called Foodventures, and they work primarily in Madagascar, which is a very important biological hotspot. And they work within the community using a method that's called population health environment, where they work in the community on all three of those areas, talking about how smaller families, increasing health care, being more respectful of the environment and the animals in the environment can increase everybody's quality of life. And they do a lot of interesting, successful work.
I guess we have time for one more quick question. So if it's complicated, wait till later. Go ahead.
I just wonder how receptive people are to hearing about population control from a group like CBD or just like any animal rights. Like, I mean, you already get enough flack for being crazy. So, I mean, I wonder how receptive people are to hearing about it.
Well, for us, first of all, we're really careful never to talk about population control, because it's not about control, it's about expanding human rights. But like I mentioned, we use things like the endangered species condoms in some of our creative campaigns. In addition to that, one slide that I showed that was from our Valentine's Day Endangered Love campaign. We did another campaign earlier this year called Crowded Planet, where we asked people to take pictures of the world around them to show us what living in a world of 7 billion looked like and felt like to them. And it was very much geared towards a U.S. audience where people don't normally think about this. We got a great response of people sending in not just crowded places, but natural areas and wildlife that they were losing, that they, that had been paved over or that they couldn't get to anymore. So I think that by finding creative ways to talk about it and by linking it to other issues that people care about, whether it's endangered species, animal rights, human rights, climate change, like all of these things are tied into it. And by linking it to those other issues that people care about is a great way to get people to open up to the conversation.
And I think the drop in global fertility rates show that people's decision about family size is malleable. It can change dramatically, probably more so than their decision, I mean, obviously more so than their decision about meat consumption. So there's a lot of hope in theory for that. But I've never met a person who, when I asked them what sort of a world they wanted their children to live in, couldn't suddenly start thinking about the dangers of runaway population growth and the impact on the environment. And once they started to project their thoughts into the future in the form of their child, they suddenly became a lot more open-minded.